After the death of his wife, an elderly man was left alone and helpless. But when a stranger approached him in the park, he revealed a secret that turned him into a hero. Autumn had arrived once again in Park Central, bringing with it a symphony of golden and reddish colors that danced in the air with each gentle breeze. The leaves fell slowly, forming a multicolored carpet over the still green grass, creating a mesmerizing contrast between the life that persisted and the ephemeral beauty of the changing seasons. George Hartley, a 58-year-old man with gray hair and tired blue eyes, sat on his usual bench, the one facing the small lake in the heart of the park. His wrinkled hands firmly held a dark wooden walking stick, more out of habit than necessity. He watched the movement around him with a distant gaze, as if he were there, but at the same time in a completely different place. The park was full of life that Saturday afternoon. Families were picnicking on the grass. Couples strolled hand in hand along the winding paths, and children ran and shouted, filling the air with their carefree laughter. For George, however, every sound of joy was like a tiny needle in his heart, painfully reminding him of what he had lost. It had been exactly 1 year since Margaret, his wife and life partner for more than 3 decades, had left this world. 1 year since cancer had finally won the battle they had fought together for so long. 1 year since George found himself alone for the first time in his adult life, lost in a world that seemed too big and too empty without her presence. As he watched the leaves falling, George allowed himself to dive into his memories. He remembered the day he met Margaret in this very park, 35 years ago. She was reading a book under the shade of an oak tree, her brown hair shining in the sunlight that filtered through the leaves. George, then a young lawyer full of dreams, summoned up all his courage to approach her. The smile she gave him at that moment changed his life forever. Now, sitting alone on that bench, George felt the weight of each day without her. The park, which had once been his refuge, his favorite place to stroll hand in hand with Margaret at weekends, had become a place of painful nostalgia. Still, he couldn't stay away. It was as if, somehow, Margaret's essence was still there, in the familiar corners and memories that every tree and path held. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching children's laughter. A group of children, no older than 5 or 6, were running towards them, chasing a colorful ball that was rolling down the path. The ball stopped at George's feet, and a little girl with blonde pigtails and bright green eyes approached him shyly. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a sweet voice. "Can you catch our ball, please?" George looked at the child, feeling a pang in his chest. She reminded him so much of his granddaughter, Sophie, who now lived on the other side of the country with her parents. Forcing a gentle smile, he bent down with difficulty and picked up the ball, handing it to the little girl. "Here you are, darling," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "Thank you," exclaimed the girl, her face lighting up with a smile that reminded George of Margaret once again. The other children approached, and soon George found himself surrounded by a small crowd of smiling faces and excited voices. "Do you always sit here?" asked a dark-haired boy with freckles on his nose. "Yes," replied George, surprised to be engaged in conversation. "This is my favorite place in the park." "Why?" asked another child, curious. George hesitated for a moment, feeling a lump in his throat. "Well," he began, "this place brings back good memories. I used to come here with my wife." "And where is she now?" The blonde-haired girl's innocent question hit George like a punch in the stomach. He swallowed, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. She's gone somewhere far away from here," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. The children seemed to sense the change in his tone, and for a moment, a silence fell over the group. Then, to George's surprise, The girl with the blonde pigtails stepped forward and, without warning, hugged him. "Don't be sad," she said, her voice muffled against George's coat. "I'm sure she still loves you, even though you're far away." George stood still for a moment, feeling the warmth of the child's embrace. Then, slowly, he returned the gesture, feeling something inside him fall apart. The tears he had held back for so long began to fall silently. The other children, moved by an instinct for compassion that only young people seem to have, joined in the hug. For a few minutes, George found himself enveloped in a circle of childlike comfort, feeling something other than the pain of loss for the first time in months. When the children finally left, called by their parents to continue their walk, George watched them walk away with a mixture of gratitude and melancholy. The brief encounter had awakened in him memories of happy times with Margaret, of shared laughter and dreams fulfilled together. As he dried his tears with the back of his hand, George noticed a figure approaching. It was a young man, perhaps in his 30s, with tousled dark hair and intense green eyes. He walked with a quiet confidence, his hands in the pockets of a worn leather jacket. The young man stopped in front of George's bench, an enigmatic smile on his lips. "Can I sit down?" he asked, indicating the empty space next to George. Still a little shaken by the encounter with the children, George just nodded, moving slightly to make room for the newcomer. The young man sat down, stretching his legs out in front of him and looking out over the lake. For a few moments, they sat in silence, watching the ducks that swam lazily in the water. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" commented the young man, finally breaking the silence. George murmured in agreement, still unsure how to react to the unexpected presence. "My name is Tom," said the young man, turning to face George with a penetrating gaze. "And you must be George Hartley." George straightened up, surprised. "How do you know my name?" Tom smiled, a smile that seemed to carry more meaning than George could comprehend at the moment. "Let's just say I know a lot about this park and the people who frequent it," he replied mysteriously. "Even about the pain you carry, George." George felt a shiver run down his spine. Who was this young man? How could he know so much? Before he could formulate an answer, Tom continued, "I know you've lost someone very important. I know that this park holds precious memories for you. And I know that you feel lost, without purpose." Tom paused, his green eyes fixed on George's. "But what if I told you there was a reason you were here today? That may be, George Hartley. Your purpose is about to reveal itself." George looked at Tom, a mixture of confusion and curiosity on his face. The young man's words echoed in his mind, awakening something he thought he had lost a long time ago: hope. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, George realized that something was about to change. The meeting with the children, and now this enigmatic conversation with Tom, seemed to be the prelude to something bigger. With his heart beating a little faster than usual, George found himself doing something he hadn't done for a long time. He allowed himself to feel curious about the future. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a little firmer than before. Tom smiled again, a smile that seemed to promise adventures and challenges. "George," he said, leaning a little closer, "let me tell you about a project that could change not only your life, but the life of this whole community." And so, as the shadows lengthened in Central Park and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, George Hartley found himself at the start of a journey he could never have imagined. A journey that would take him from the depths of his pain to a new purpose, a new family, and, perhaps, a new chance to honor the love he and Margaret had shared for so many years. Dusk was giving way to night in Central Park, the street lamps turning on one by one, creating an almost magical atmosphere. George Hartley was still sitting on the bench, his attention fully on Tom, the enigmatic young man who had just entered his life with promises of purpose and change. "A project?" George asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. What kind of project could change the life of an entire community? Tom leaned back in his seat, his green eyes shining with an intensity that George found almost mesmerizing. "George, what do you see when you look at this park?" George frowned, confused by the question. He let his gaze wander over the familiar scenery, the centuries-old trees, the winding paths, the placid lake reflecting the first stars of the night. "I see memories," he finally replied, his voice breaking. "I see the place where I met Margaret, where we made our best memories." Tom nodded, understanding. "Exactly. This park is more than just a piece of land with trees and a lake. It's the heart of this community, a repository of collective memories, a place where generations met, fell in love, raised their families." George felt a lump form in his throat. Tom's words echoed his own feelings about the park, feelings he had barely been able to articulate to himself over the last year. "But what if I told you," Tom continued, leaning forward, "that there are people who see this park only as valuable land, ready to be exploited and turned into profit?" The confusion on George's face gave way to an expression of alarm. "What do you mean?" Tom sighed deeply before continuing. "There's a real estate project underway, George. A project that intends to demolish a large part of this park to make way for a luxury apartment complex and a shopping center." George felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The idea that the park, his refuge, the place that held so many precious memories, could be destroyed was almost inconceivable. But that can't happen," he stammered. "This park is protected, isn't it? It's city property." Tom shook his head sadly. "It should be, but corruption has deep roots, George. The project is being pushed by a group of influential businessmen with connections in the local government. They are using dubious tactics to get around the preservation laws." George felt a wave of anger rise up inside him, an emotion he hadn't experienced for a long time. The idea that someone could destroy something so precious to so many people, just out of greed, revolted him deeply. "How do you know all this, Tom?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. Tom hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much he could reveal. "I'm part of a group of locals who discovered these plans," he finally explained. "We're ordinary people, teachers, nurses, pensioners, united by a love of this community and a determination to protect it." George nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "And what are you doing about it?" "We're fighting, George," Tom replied, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Collecting evidence, organizing protests, trying to alert the community. But it's an uphill battle. We need all the voices we can muster." George was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the shadows that danced across the lake. Memories of Margaret flooded his mind, their first meeting under the great oak, the Sunday picnics, the walks hand in hand at sunset. The idea that all this could be erased, replaced by concrete and glass, was unbearable. "How can I help?" he finally asked, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Tom's face lit up with a smile. "Are you sure, George? It's not going to be easy." "We'll be up against powerful people." George straightened his shoulders, feeling a determination he hadn't experienced for a long time. "Margaret always said that we should fight for what we believe in," he said, his voice gaining strength. "She loved this park as much as I do. I can't stand by while they try to destroy it." Tom held out his hand, which George shook firmly. "Welcome to the fight, George," he said with a warm smile. "There's a meeting of our group tomorrow. Would you like to come?" George nodded, feeling a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "I'll be there." As they walked together out of the park, Tom shared more details about the group and its efforts. George listened intently, feeling something awaken inside him, a sense of purpose that had long been dormant. The next morning, George woke up with an energy he hadn't felt for months. He dressed carefully, choosing a shirt that Margaret always liked on him. Before leaving, he stopped in front of her photograph on the bedside table. "You'd be proud of me, wouldn't you, darling?" he murmured, gently touching her smiling face to the photo. For a moment, he could almost hear her voice, encouraging him as she always did. The meeting was scheduled to take place in the community library, an old red-brick building in the heart of the city. When George arrived, he found a back room full of people of all ages. Tom greeted him at the door with a warm smile. "How nice of you to come, George," he said, guiding him into the room. "Let me introduce you to the others." George was introduced to a variety of smiling faces and outstretched hands. There was Linda, a retired teacher with kind eyes; Carlos, a young environmental law student; Sarah, a single mother who worked as a nurse; and many others. Each had their own story, their own reason for fighting for the park. When the meeting began, George found himself immersed in a whirlwind of information. Maps were spread out, documents examined, strategies discussed. He was impressed by the group's dedication and knowledge. Linda, the retired teacher, was explaining the legal details of the case when something in her story caught George's attention. "Wait," he interrupted, a sudden memory popping into his mind. "You mentioned a specific clause in the original deed to the park. I think I can help with that." All eyes turned to him, and George felt a blush creep up his neck. But the memory was clear now, a case he had worked on years ago when he was still an active lawyer. "There was a similar case in a neighboring town about 15 years ago," he explained, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "We used a specific interpretation of this type of clause to block a development project. I still have the files somewhere." The room was silent for a moment, then erupted in a wave of excitement. Tom smiled broadly, putting a hand on George's shoulder. "Looks like we've got a new trump card up our sleeve," he said, looking around the room. "George, you've just given us new hope." As the meeting continued, now with a new focus thanks to his contribution, George felt something he hadn't experienced for a long time, a sense of belonging, of purpose. Looking around the room at the determined faces of his new allies, he realized that he had found a new family, united by a common cause, and somewhere, deep in his heart, he sensed that Margaret would be smiling, proud to see him fighting for something they both believed in so deeply. When the meeting ended hours later, George went out into the night with a new vigor in his step. The road ahead would be difficult, he knew, but for the first time in a long time, he felt alive. Really alive. Passing through the park on his way home, George stopped for a moment, looking at the trees that now seemed more precious than ever. "We'll fight for you," he murmured to the silent park. "I promise." And with that promise echoing in his heart, George Hartley walked home, ready for the next chapter of his life. A chapter of struggle, hope, and perhaps redemption. The days following the first meeting passed like a whirlwind for George Hartley. After months, no, years of emotional lethargy, he now found himself in the middle of a storm of activity and purpose that left him simultaneously exhausted and invigorated. Every morning, George woke up with a new energy. It wasn't the same frenetic energy of his youth, but something deeper, more meaningful. It was as if every breath had a new purpose. Every beat of his heart echoed with the promise he had made in the park that night. Her apartment, which for so long had been a silent mausoleum of memories, was now buzzing with life. The dining room table, once covered in dust and framed photographs, was now cluttered with papers, maps, and legal documents. The computer that Margaret had insisted he buy, but which he rarely used, was now constantly on, the screen glowing with emails, research, and draft petitions. One particularly sunny morning, George found himself rummaging through an old box at the back of the cupboard. His fingers brushed against something familiar, a weathered leather folder. He pulled it out, a cloud of dust dancing in the air, and opened it carefully. There were the case files he had mentioned at the meeting, preserved as if they had been waiting for this moment. "Oh, Margaret," he murmured, a sad smile playing on his lips. "You always said I should never throw anything away. I guess you were right, as always." Leafing through the yellowed documents, George felt a familiar surge of excitement, the same he used to feel when diving into a complex case. His eyes raced across the pages, his mind making connections it hadn't made for years. It was as if a dormant part of him was finally waking up. That afternoon, he arrived at the community library carrying the case like it was a precious treasure. Tom and Linda were already there, leaning over a pile of documents. "George!" Tom exclaimed, his face lighting up at the sight of the older man. "You look different today." George smiled, placing the folder on the table. "I've found something that might help us," he said, opening it and spreading out the documents. "It's the case I mentioned. I think we can use the same strategy here." For the next few days, George worked tirelessly with Tom, Linda, and the other members of the group. His evenings were spent reviewing legal documents, his mornings in strategy meetings. He was surprised to discover that his skills as a lawyer, although a little rusty, were still sharp. It was during one of these long nights at work that George found himself alone with Linda in the library. She watched him over her reading glasses, a gentle smile on her face. "You know, George," she said softly, "it's wonderful to see you like this. So, alive." George stopped, surprised by the comment. Thank you, Linda. I think I feel alive for the first time in a long time." Linda nodded, understanding. "Loss is something we all deal with in different ways," she said. "Some shut down, others throw themselves into work. But finding a purpose, that can be truly transformative." George felt a lump form in his throat. "You talk as if you know what you're talking about." Linda smiled sadly. "My husband, Jack, died 5 years ago. Cancer, just like your Margaret." She paused, her eyes distant for a moment. "I thought I'd never find joy in life again. But then I found this group, this cause." George reached out, gently touching Linda's arm. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly. "And thank you for sharing that with me." Linda covered his hand with her own. "We're stronger together, George. That's what this fight teaches us." At that moment, George felt something change inside him. The pain of losing Margaret, which had been a crushing weight for so long, began to transform into something different. No less painful, perhaps, but more purposeful. As if her pain could be channeled into something meaningful, something that could make a difference. The days turned into weeks, and George found himself increasingly involved not just in the fight for the park, but in the life of the community. He began to get to know the faces and stories behind the names. Carlos, the law student, who had grown up playing in the park and dreamed of one day taking his own children there to play. Sarah, the nurse, who found peace and renewal walking along the tree-lined paths after long shifts at the hospital. One afternoon, while handing out leaflets in the park with Sarah, George found himself telling stories about Margaret, about how she loved feeding the ducks in the pond, about the Sunday picnics they had under the big oak tree. To his surprise, talking about her brought not only pain, but also a sweet nostalgia. "She seems to have been an incredible woman," Sarah commented, her eyes shining with unshed tears. George smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "She was," he said softly. "And she would have loved to see all of us united like this, fighting for something we believe in." As the days passed, George felt his confidence growing. He began to speak at community meetings, his voice gaining strength and conviction. His skills as a lawyer, combined with his newfound passion, made him a powerful spokesperson for the cause. It was during one of these meetings that George had an epiphany. Looking around the room at the determined faces of his fellow fighters, he realized that he had found more than a cause. He had found a new family. That evening, sitting on his favorite bench in the park, George took off the wedding ring he was still wearing. For a long moment, he held it in his palm, feeling its familiar weight. "Oh, Margaret," he whispered into the night, "I'll always love you. But I think it's time to live again, for real." With a smooth movement, he put the ring in his pocket. He wasn't ready to let her go completely, but it was a start. A small step towards a future that, for the first time in years, seemed bright and full of possibilities. As he walked home, George felt a lightness in his step. The park around him seemed more alive than ever, every tree, every leaf a reminder of what was at stake and what was worth fighting for. On the horizon, the lights of the city glowed, a reminder of the challenges still to come. But George Hartley was no longer afraid. He was ready to face whatever came, with his new friends by his side and Margaret's spirit guiding his heart. When he got home, George paused for a moment in front of the photograph of Margaret on the bedside table. Her smile, frozen in time, seemed different now, no longer a painful reminder of what he had lost, but a gentle encouragement for what was to come. "Thank you," he whispered to the photo, touching it gently, "for teaching me how to love, and now, for teaching me how to live again." And with those words, George Hartley prepared for bed, his heart filled with an emotion he hadn't felt for a long time. Hope. Tomorrow would be another day of struggle, another day to make a difference. And for the first time in years, he couldn't wait to see what the new day would bring. Summer was giving way to fall, and with the changing of the seasons, the fight for Parka Central took on a new urgency. George Hartley, now fully immersed in the cause, felt the tension grow with each passing day. The group had made significant progress, but the forces arrayed against them were powerful and implacable. One cool October morning, George arrived at the community library to find Tom and Linda in a heated argument. Tom's normally calm face was tense, his eyebrows furrowed in concern. "What happened?" George asked, immediately sensing that something was wrong. Linda sighed heavily, running a hand through her gray hair. "We've just received information that the city council is going to hold a surprise vote on the development project next week." George felt his stomach sink. But that's a lot sooner than we expected. We're not ready." Tom nodded somberly. "Exactly. They're trying to catch us off guard. If this vote passes, we'll have lost our best chance of stopping the project legally." George felt a wave of anger rise up inside him. It was exactly the kind of dirty tactics he used to face in his days as a lawyer. But now, with so much at stake, it seemed even more unfair. "We can't let this happen," he said, his voice firm with determination. "What's the plan?" Over the next few days, the group worked tirelessly. George barely saw his bed, spending whole nights in the library or his apartment, reviewing documents, preparing arguments, and coordinating strategies with other members of the group. One afternoon, while George was in the park handing out leaflets and talking to local residents, he noticed a group of men in suits watching from afar. Their cold, calculating stares reminded him of sharks circling their prey. Sarah, who was helping with the leaflets, followed his gaze. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice low and worried. George frowned. "I think they're representatives of the development company. They're watching us, trying to gauge how serious our opposition is." Sarah swallowed. "They look dangerous." George put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry. They may have money and influence, but we have something much more powerful: the truth and the support of the community." But even as he said these words, George felt a twinge of worry. The battle was getting more intense, and he knew that things would probably get worse before they got better. His fears were confirmed the next morning, when Tom urgently called him in for an emergency meeting. When George arrived at the library, he found the group in a state of agitation. "What's happened?" he asked, looking around at the worried faces. Carlos, the young law student, spoke first, his voice shaking with anger. "They're playing dirty, George. Very dirty." Tom nodded somberly. "We've received information that the development company is planning a smear campaign against our group. They're going to portray us as anti-progress radicals, trying to stop the city's economic growth." George felt his blood boil. "This is ridiculous. We're concerned citizens, fighting to preserve a valuable public space." Linda sighed heavily. "Unfortunately, George, the truth doesn't always win in the court of public opinion. They have the resources to flood the local media with their message." George was silent for a moment, his mind racing. Then, slowly, a smile began to form on his face. "Maybe," he said slowly, "we can use that to our advantage." All eyes turned to him, curious. "Think about it," George continued, his voice gaining confidence. "If they're willing to resort to such low tactics, it only proves that they're desperate. And if they're desperate, it's because they know we're getting close to something," Tom added, a glint of understanding in his eyes. George nodded emphatically. "Exactly. Besides, if we can expose their dirty tactics, it might turn public opinion in our favor." The group spent the next few hours devising a strategy to counter the smear campaign. George suggested a series of interviews with local residents, sharing personal stories about what the park meant to them. Linda proposed a social media campaign showing the park's positive impact on the community. As they worked, George felt a surge of pride as he saw how the group had grown and strengthened. Each member brought their own unique skills and perspectives, and together, they formed a formidable force. At the end of the meeting, Tom pulled George aside. "You know this means you'll have to make yourself more visible, right?" he said quietly. "We need a strong spokesperson, someone who can articulate our cause clearly and convincingly." George felt a sudden knot in his stomach. The idea of putting himself on the front line, of becoming a public target, was frightening. But then he remembered Margaret, how she always encouraged him to face his fears. "I'll do whatever it takes," he replied, his voice firm. In the days that followed, George found himself on a roller coaster of emotions. There were moments of triumph, like when he gave an impassioned interview on local radio, brilliantly articulating the arguments in favor of preserving the park. And there were moments of despair, as when he saw the first defamatory ads appear in the local newspapers. One evening, exhausted after a long day of meetings and interviews, George found himself back on his favorite bench in the park. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As he watched the families enjoying the last moments of daylight, playing and laughing, he felt a renewed conviction. "This is what we're fighting for," he muttered to himself. "It's not just about trees and grass. It's about community, about memories, about the future." At that moment, George heard footsteps approaching. It was Sarah, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," she said with a kind smile, handing him one of the cups. George gratefully accepted the coffee. "Thank you, Sarah. Not just for the coffee, but for everything. You've all given me a new reason to live." Sarah sat down next to him, her eyes shining with emotion. "And you've given us hope, George. Your strength, your determination. You inspire us all." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sunset. George felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He thought of Margaret, how she always said that the best things in life come from the hardest struggles. "You know," he said softly, "a year ago, I thought my life was over, that there was nothing left to live for. But now—" Sarah placed a hand gently on his. "Now you're more alive than ever." George nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "And no matter what happens, no matter how hard things get, I know I'm not alone in this fight." As the sun disappeared over the horizon, George Hartley felt a mixture of fear and determination. The battle for Central Park was far from over, and the days ahead would be difficult. But with his new friends by his side and Margaret's spirit guiding his heart, he was ready to face any storm that came. Night fell over the park, the first stars beginning to shine in the sky. George and Sarah got up, ready to go back to work. Tomorrow would be another day of struggle, another day to make a difference, and George couldn't wait to take on the challenge. Autumn had given way to winter, and a thin layer of frost covered Central Park every morning. For George Hartley, each ice crystal felt like a reminder of the fragility of the situation, of the delicate balance on which the park's future rested. The date of the public hearing was fast approaching, marking the culmination of months of preparation, strategy, and tireless struggle. George felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but rather than crushing him, this pressure seemed to strengthen him, sharpening his resolve like a blade. One particularly cold morning, George arrived early at the community library, which had become the group's unofficial headquarters. To his surprise, he found Tom already there, his eyes red with fatigue, surrounded by piles of documents. "Did you sleep here?" George asked, concern evident in his voice. Tom looked up, a tired smile on his face. "Someone has to keep the lights on," he joked, but the exhaustion in his voice was palpable. George sat down next to him, examining the scattered papers. "Tom, you can't go on like this. We need you fully fit for the hearing." Tom sighed deeply, rubbing his eyes. I know. It's just—" "George, what if it's not enough? What if, after all that work, we fail?" George felt his heart squeeze. He recognized in that moment of Tom's vulnerability the same fear that he himself carried. Gently, he put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Tom, look at me," he said firmly. "We're not going to fail. Do you know why? Because we're not just fighting for trees and grass. We're fighting for the heart of this community, and a cause like that, well, it's invincible." Tom looked at George, a mixture of surprise and admiration in his eyes. "When did you become so wise, old friend?" George laughed softly. "I think I learned from the best," he replied, giving a wink. In the days that followed, the pace of work intensified. The community library became a hive of activity, with volunteers coming and going at all hours, bringing in new information, distributing leaflets, coordinating awareness-raising events. George found himself at the center of this maelstrom, his experience as a lawyer proving invaluable in preparing for the hearing. He worked tirelessly with Carlos, the young law student, refining arguments, anticipating counter-arguments, preparing for every possible eventuality. One evening, as they reviewed their strategy for the umpteenth time, Carlos looked at George with a curious expression. "Mr. Hartley," he began hesitantly, "can I ask you a personal question?" George nodded, intrigued. "Of course, Carlos, and please, call me George." Carlos took a deep breath. How do you do it? How do you find the strength to keep fighting, even when things seem impossible? George was silent for a moment, pondering the question. Finally, he answered. You know, Carlos, a few months ago I would have said that I didn't know, that I was just moving on because I had nothing left to lose. But now, he paused, a soft smile forming on his face. Now I know it's because I have everything to gain. This fight, it gave me my life back. It gave me a purpose, a family. Carlos nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Thank you, George. That means a lot. As the date of the hearing drew closer, the tension in the town was palpable. The local newspapers were full of articles about the conflict. Social media was buzzing with heated debates. George found himself in the eye of the hurricane, his face appearing in newspapers and on local television, his voice echoing on the city's radio stations. The smear campaign against the group had intensified, with increasingly absurd accusations being hurled. But for each attack, George and his friends responded with dignity and truth, gaining more and more respect and support from the community. On the eve of the hearing, the group gathered in the park for a final moment of reflection and unity. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, George looked around at the faces of his fellow fighters, Linda, with her wisdom and compassion, Tom, with his tireless energy and strategic vision, Sarah, with her kindness and determination, Carlos, with his youth and passion, and so many others, each bringing their own strengths and stories to the cause. Friends, George began, his voice heavy with emotion, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I am honored to have fought alongside each and every one of you. You taught me the true meaning of community, of purpose, of love. Linda approached, tears shining in her eyes. Oh, George, she said softly, it was you who taught us. Your courage, your determination. You showed us that it's never too late to make a difference. One by one, the group members drew closer, sharing hugs, words of encouragement and promises to stick together, no matter the outcome. As the group began to disperse, Sarah stayed behind, her eyes fixed on George with an intensity that took him by surprise. George, she said, her voice almost a whisper, there's something I need to tell you. George's heart raced, a mixture of anticipation and fear taking hold of him. What is it, Sarah? She took a step forward, narrowing the distance between them. I think I'm falling in love with you. George felt as if the world had stopped. For a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own heart beating. Memories of Margaret flooded his mind, mixing with images of Sarah, of their moments together over the last few months. Sarah, he began, his voice breaking. She placed a finger gently on his lips. You don't have to say anything now, she said softly. I needed you to know. Before tomorrow. Before everything changes. George nodded slowly, unable to form words. Sarah leaned in, placing a soft kiss on his cheek, before turning and walking away, leaving George alone with his swirling thoughts. That night, lying in his bed, George couldn't sleep. His heart was torn between the past and the future, between the memory of Margaret and the possibility of a new love, and hanging over it all, the shadow of tomorrow's hearing, the final showdown that would decide the fate of the park and, in many ways, the fate of them all. He stood up, walking over to the window. The full moon bathed the city in a silvery light, and in the distance, he could see the silhouette of the trees in Central Park. George closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Margaret, he whispered to the night, give me strength. Show me the way. When he opened his eyes again, a sense of calm enveloped him, Tomorrow would be the most important day of his new life. And no matter the outcome, he knew he wouldn't be alone. He had a community by his side, a purpose in his heart, and maybe, just maybe, a new love on the horizon. With that resolution, George Hartley went back to bed, ready to face whatever the dawn brought. The final battle for Central Park was about to begin, and he was prepared to give his all for Margaret's memory, for the future of his community, and for the new life he had found in the midst of the struggle. Dawn on the day of the public hearing came with an almost surreal stillness. George Hartley woke before the alarm clock, his heart racing with a mixture of anxiety and determination. He got up slowly, each movement deliberate, as if he were preparing for battle. As he tidied himself up, George stopped in front of the mirror, amazed at the transformation he saw reflected back at him. The man staring back at him was no longer the bereaved, aimless widower of months ago. In his place was a warrior, his eyes shining with purpose, the lines of his face marked not only by age, but by determination. "We're ready for this, Margaret," he murmured, adjusting the tie she had given him years ago. For a moment, he could almost feel her presence beside him, encouraging and strong as she had always been. On arriving at the town hall, where the hearing was to be held, George was greeted by a scene that left him breathless. Hundreds of people crowded onto the steps and into the street, many carrying placards in defense of Parque Central. Familiar and strange faces mingled, united in a common cause. Tom was the first to spot him, making his way through the crowd. "George!" he called out, a strained smile on his face. "You won't believe what's happened." Before George could ask, Linda and Carlos joined them, their faces a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "What happened?" George asked, sensing the tension in the air. Linda replied, her voice shaking slightly. "An anonymous informant contacted us last night. He has concrete evidence of corruption involving some members of the city council and the developers." George's heart raced. "This could change everything," he said, his mind racing with the implications. Carlos nodded emphatically. "We've already incorporated the information into our presentation. If we play our cards right, we can not only save the park, but expose the whole corrupt scheme." George looked at his companions, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude. "You guys are incredible," he said, his voice laced with emotion. "No matter what happens today, know that we did everything we could." Just then, Sarah approached the group. Her eyes met George's, and for an instant, the world around them seemed to disappear. The confession of the night before hung between them, unspoken, but palpable. "It's time," she said softly, breaking the silence. George nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's go." The group entered City Hall, the crowd opening up to give way, voices whispering words of encouragement. Inside the courtroom, the air was charged with tension. On one side, George and his group. On the other, the developers and their lawyers, their faces serious and determined. When the president of the city council called the session to order, the silence that fell over the room was almost palpable. George felt the weight of hundreds of stares on him when he was called to make his presentation. With firm steps, he made his way to the podium. For a moment, he looked out at the audience, seeing familiar faces, the newspaper vendor who always had a friendly smile, the retired teacher who walked her dog every morning, the young couple who had recently had their first child, all of them counting on him, on them, to save a vital piece of their lives. George began to speak, his voice initially low, but gaining strength with each word. He talked about the history of the park, about the generations who had grown up playing on its lawns, about the moments of joy and solace that this green space had provided for the community. "This park is not just a piece of land," he said, his voice echoing through the room. "It is the beating heart of our community. It's where we meet, where we laugh, where we cry, where we fall in love. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. I met my late wife in this park. We spent our Sundays there, planning our future under its trees, and when I lost her, it was there that I found solace, and eventually, a new purpose. The emotion in his voice was palpable, and George could see tears in the eyes of many in the audience. But he knew that sentiment wouldn't be enough. With a nod to Carlos, he switched to the legal and economic arguments they had prepared. With surgical precision, George and his team presented their arguments. They showed how the park contributed to the physical and mental health of the community, how it increased the value of the surrounding properties, how it attracted tourists and businesses to the area. And then, at the crucial moment, they revealed the evidence of corruption. A shocked murmur ran through the room as compromising emails and records of suspicious transactions were projected onto the screen. George watched the faces of the developers and their allies on the board turn pale. He felt a twinge of pity, but quickly pushed it away. This was about more than individuals. It was about the future of an entire community. The other side's presentation was anticlimactic in comparison. Their arguments about progress and economic development rang hollow in the face of revelations of corruption. When the last speaker finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. The president of the council, visibly shaken, announced a recess so that they could deliberate. The next few hours were an agonizing wait. George and his group gathered in a corner of the room, exchanging nervous glances and words of encouragement. Sarah approached George, gently touching his arm. "No matter what," she said softly, "you were amazing there." George smiled, covering her hand with his. "We were amazing," he corrected gently. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the council returned. The chairman, his face grave, addressed the assembly. After careful consideration, he began, his voice echoing in the silent room, and in light of the revelations presented today, the council voted unanimously to reject the development project and to permanently preserve Central Park as a protected public space. For a moment, the silence persisted, as if no one could believe what they had heard. Then, suddenly, the room erupted in applause and shouts of joy. George found himself wrapped in a collective hug with his group, tears of relief and happiness flowing freely. When they finally made it out of the building, they were greeted by a jubilant crowd. The news had spread quickly, and it seemed that half the city was there to celebrate. Amid the hubbub of hugs and congratulations, George found himself being lifted onto the shoulders of the crowd, hailed as a hero. He laughed, a genuine, carefree laugh that he hadn't given for years. Looking up at the sky, at the trees in the park in the distance, George felt a deep peace envelop him. "We did it, Margaret," he whispered. "We really did it." As night fell, the celebration moved into the park. Lights were hung from the trees, music played, and people of all ages danced and laughed under the stars. George found a moment of quiet, sitting down on his favorite bench. Sarah met him there, sitting next to him in silence. "So," she said after a while, "what happens now?" George looked at her, seeing the future reflected in her eyes. "Now," he said softly, "now we start the next chapter." And as the celebration continued around them, George Hartley felt his heart expand with possibilities. The park was saved, the community was united, and he, for the first time in a long time, was truly looking forward to what the future held. Spring arrived in Millbrook with an explosion of color and life, as if nature itself were celebrating the community's victory. The Central Park, once threatened with destruction, was now blooming more vibrantly than ever, its trees laden with flowers, its paths full of smiling people. George Hartley walked along these familiar paths, marveling at the changes the last few months had brought, not just to the park, but to the whole city, and most importantly, to himself. The victory at the public hearing had only been the beginning. The revelations of corruption led to a wide-ranging investigation, resulting in several arrests and a complete overhaul of the city council. Millbrook was undergoing a transformation, with new leaders committed to transparency and the well-being of the community. The group that had fought so hard to save the park did not dissolve after the victory. On the contrary, they became an active force in the city, working on various community projects. Tom had been elected to the new city council, bringing his passion and energy to the local administration. Linda coordinated an environmental education program in the park, teaching children about the importance of nature and conservation. Carlos Dow, inspired by the struggle, decided to specialize in environmental law, determined to protect other threatened green spaces. Sarah, with her compassionate heart, started an outdoor therapy program in the park, helping people find healing and peace in nature. And George? Well, George Hartley had become something of a local legend. People would stop him in the street to thank him, to share stories about what the park meant to them. But for George, the greatest reward was the transformation he saw in himself. That spring morning, as he walked through the park, George reflected on this transformation. A year ago, he was a lost man, consumed by grief, without purpose or direction. Now, he felt more alive than ever, connected not only to the community around him, but to something greater within himself. His steps took him to the large oak tree where he and Margaret used to picnic. With a gentle smile, he touched the tree's rough trunk. "You'd be proud, Margaret," he murmured. "Not just of the park, but of me. I think I finally understood what you always said about finding joy in life, no matter what." A movement caught his eye, and George saw Sarah approaching, carrying a picnic basket. His heart warmed at the sight of her, a feeling that still surprised him with its intensity. In the months since the hearing, George and Sarah had gradually grown closer. George had initially struggled with feelings of guilt, fearing that he was betraying Margaret's memory. But over time, and with the gentle help of Linda and his other friends, he began to understand that love was not a finite thing, that it was possible to honor the past while embracing the future. "Good morning, hero," Sarah said with a mischievous smile, approaching him. George laughed, pulling her into a hug. "Good morning, my savior," he replied, planting a soft kiss on her lips. They sat under the oak tree, spreading out the contents of the basket. As they ate and talked, George couldn't help but notice how this moment echoed so many others he had shared with Margaret in this very place. But instead of pain, he felt a deep gratitude for his memories with Margaret, and for the chance to create new memories with Sarah. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, noticing his distant gaze. George smiled, taking her hand. "I'm thinking about how surprising life is, how, even when we think all is lost, it finds a way to surprise us with new joys, new purposes." Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with understanding. "You've changed so many lives, George, including mine." George shook his head gently. "We've changed lives together. All of us. And that's the real miracle." As the morning progressed, the park began to fill with life. Families were picnicking, children were running and playing, couples were strolling hand in hand. George watched it all with a sense of accomplishment that was beyond words. Tom showed up later, accompanied by Linda and Carlos. They joined George and Sarah, sharing news and laughter. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by plans for the future, new projects for the park, ideas for further improving the community. "You know," Tom said in a moment's pause, "this all started with you, George. Your courage, your determination, You inspired us all." George felt a lump in his throat, moved by his friend's words. "No, Tom," he replied softly. "It started with all of us, with a community that refused to give up on what was important." Linda smiled, her eyes shining with wisdom. "Maybe that's what the park really represents," she reflected. "Not just trees and grass, but the power of people united by a common purpose." Everyone nodded, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. As the afternoon progressed, the group said goodbye, each going their separate ways. George and Sarah remained, walking hand in hand along the paths of the park. "I have a surprise for you," Sarah said, a mysterious smile on her lips. She guided him to a new flower bed by the lake. There, amidst a sea of vibrant colors, was a small plaque, in memory of Margaret Hartley, whose love for this park continues to inspire. George felt hot tears welling up in his eyes, a soft sob escaping his lips. Sarah hugged him silently, offering comfort and understanding. "It's perfect," George whispered at last. "Absolutely perfect." They stood there for a long moment, George lost in memories and gratitude. When he finally pulled away, his eyes met Sarah's, full of love and promise. "I'm ready," he said softly. Sarah tilted her head, curious. Ready for what? George smiled, feeling lighter than he had ever felt. For the next chapter, for the future, for us. Sarah's smile lit up her face, and she leaned in for a deep, loving kiss. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, George and Sarah walked slowly out of the park. George took one last look back at the place that had been the setting for so many chapters of his life. He saw the bench where he had met Tom, the trees under which he had played with the children who had rekindled his hope, the lake where he had shared so many moments with his new friends, and now the flower bed that honored Margaret, uniting past and present in a promise of the future. George Hartley left Central Park that evening not as a man divided between past and present, but as a complete man, a man who had learned that love, like a well-kept park, could grow, change, and flourish in unexpected and wonderful ways. And as he walked towards his future, hand in hand with Sarah, George carried with him not only Margaret's memory, but the lessons his journey had taught him, that it is never too late for a new beginning, that community has the power to move mountains, and that love, in all its forms, is the most powerful force of all. Central Park would remain there, a silent testament to this truth, its trees whispering stories of loss, love, and renewal for generations to come. And in every flower that bloomed, in every child that laughed, in every couple that fell in love under its trees, the spirit of George, of Margaret, and of all those who fought to preserve it would live on forever. So, as the sun set over Millbrook, George Hartley walked towards his future, his heart filled with gratitude, love, and a deep peace that he never thought he would find again. The park had been saved, a community strengthened, and a life reborn. And that, George knew, was only the beginning. Did this narrative stir your emotions? Don't forget to express your approval with a like. Take advantage of the Super Thanks feature, available just below the video, to offer direct support to the channel and contribute to the production of more fascinating content. Subscribe and remember to activate the bell to stay up to date with all the latest updates. And attention, a new exciting story is already ready to be displayed on your screen. Your participation means a lot to me, and I hope to count on your presence soon. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to this video.